I think Temple Buell was one of the great architects of Colorado. Things we still use and cherish to this day, whether it's the Paramount Theater or whether it's Cherry Creek shopping area. He was the person who envisioned the city that we live in today.
He was a successful architect in Illinois, and then he got sick and came out here to die.
He has designed over 300 buildings across the state.
He was the person that bought the city dump on the east side of town. By the way, we know that as Cherry Creek Shopping Center today.
But also the 23,000 malls that kind of built up across the nation after Buell's lead.
So in a sense, he really is the father of the contemporary shopping mall. The way we move about as humans in cities today were dramatically impacted by the way he reorganized how we do the simple act of shopping.
A man who should have died from his World War I injuries somehow survived to create intriguing, innovative architecture and lasting beauty that define a big piece of the West. Meet a man whose name perhaps you've seen on the side of a building, but whose shrines of entertainment, education, and commerce have changed the very way we live. Meet Temple Hoyne Buell.
This program was made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with additional funding provided in memory of Deanna E. LaCamera and members like you. With special thanks to the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, and to these organizations.
Temple Hoyne Buell's architecture spanned decades and a multitude of uses. But what his buildings all share is a reverence for design. He built cathedrals of life.
Great architects are frequently influenced by architects who've come before them. While Temple Buell never said he was influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago, I have to believe that he was, in fact. Not only was he growing up in Illinois at the time that Wright and other followers of Wright were practicing architecture in Chicago, but his architecture does remind me of Wright's buildings, but no one else designed quite like him. And when you see a Temple Buell building to this day, you know it's a Temple Buell building.
Temple Buell's nickname was Sandy, and it came from, I believe, a Scotsman who was also in the Army. Thought Buell was Scotch because he had this big, red, sandy mustache that apparently with his helmet on, you could only see the mustache in his eyes.
It sounds like he was just great fun. He loved to go out and be social. A friend of his said that anywhere there was a black tie and a dinner jacket, Temple Buell would be found there. He was an exuberant person and had a great appetite for life. My first introduction to Temple Buell was actually when I was in architecture school at the University of Illinois. Our building there is the Temple Buell School of Architecture. So early on I knew this name and I knew this person was very important in architectural history. It really wasn't until I moved to Denver that I began to understand how influential he was, not just here in Denver, but really nationally.
He was from, on his mother's side, one of the very earliest Chicago families. I think it would be great-grandfather helped found Chicago. He had quite the Chicago pedigree.
He was born in Chicago, September of 1895, which was a time right after the National Panic of 1893. So it's my understanding that his family, although prominent in name and stature, didn't have much left after the Panic of 1893. So he was born into a sort of a hybrid family without any money.
Temple grew up in Chicago. It was the center of architecture in America. So clearly that rubbed off on him.
After graduating from the University of Illinois, Buell went on to earn a master's degree in architecture at Columbia in New York, while also absorbing the city's architectural gifts. He then returned to Chicago to start his career.
His most notable job there was he worked for the firm of Rapp and Rapp, and they did theaters. And he loved theater work. And he was just getting his start when World War I came along. He was in a number of battles, and the Germans began attacking using gas. Temple Buell was told of this stuff would roll in like a green cloud, and an officer like himself had to give orders. And that meant he had to take off his gas mask ever briefly to give the orders.
I had been gassed a number of times, not badly, I didn't think.
After the war, Buell returned to Chicago and started a life with a new love. But his happiness with Marjorie Kelly McIntosh would soon be haunted by an invisible war wound.
So it was one of these great matches of two young people from prominent Chicago families. He's a war veteran, come back to town to be in a prominent architecture firm, and everything looked great. And then one day he collapsed while he was playing a game of squash. And that's where he learned that the phosgene gas had, in fact, not gone away. And he had severely damaged lungs. Temple Buell and his wife Marjorie moved to Denver in 1919, following the doctor's orders to come to the sanitariums.
Not one to sit idly, he spent many hours of his lengthy recuperation memorizing maps of Denver. This knowledge laid the foundation for Buell's hundreds of future buildings. A big man physically, he also had outsized ambitions.
He was about 6'4". Wouldn't say he had an overbearing personality, and yet he liked to have things his way, and became upset if that was not the case. He could really focus on, I'm going to get better, I'm going to become an architect and start an architecture firm in Denver. And he did it. He didn't admire people who couldn't have goals they met, leading to later in life that he was quite critical of his children if they weren't following that ideal. He was a workaholic. If he had to stay long hours at the office, he would do it. Early on, because he might have what they called the bacillus from his ailment, they said, you can't kiss your children, or can't be close to them. And he blamed that for, being under doctor's orders not to be physically close to his children. Unfortunately, it also developed that he was not emotionally close to them.
Buell did pour his emotions into his buildings. One of his most spectacular early successes and his first major commission came in 1929. While others were reeling from the stock market crash, Buell was creating an opulent landmark, informed by his work at Rapp and Rapp.
A firm in Chicago that was probably the top firm in the country for the development of really spectacular atmospheric theaters. The old kind from the 1910s and 20s, where going to the movie was not just the experience, literally going inside the building and being taken away, lifted up to some foreign place, some exotic locale. I think the architectural exuberance of the Paramount begins the minute you approach the building. One of the first things you'll notice are these very richly decorated terracotta friezes. They're filled with all kinds of organic imagery.
We have rosettes, all of these plumes of ornamentation that really run up the facade over its 12 bays.
The other thing you'll notice is this beautiful verticality of the buildings. That's so typical in the Art Deco period, where you'll see pilasters that just go from the ground to the sky. The real architectural fun begins the minute you walk in, and you're in just this riotous explosion of color and pattern. The spectacular silk murals that recall figures from Italian theater. All of this works together to create an environment where you're just lifted out of your daily cares and concerns, and you're taken to this place that's almost heavenly. You are in literally a sort of temple of the arts.
Temples of learning, schools, were among his most notable masterpieces. Over his career, he would design and build dozens of educational havens, brick by brick.
The Fruitdale School, built in 1927, was one of the first schools that Temple Buell did. And in this school, you really begin to see his architectural style mature. It's a simple brick building, but that's where you see the first examples of when he is taking brick and using it to make this incredibly rich ornament.
It looks like woven brick. And we see this elaborate zigzag detailing along the cornice of the facade and above the main entryways. We also have multiple pane windows, which is another hallmark of the Art Deco style.
We got to the point where one fellow, very complimentary, said, well, you have to have a Buell school. If you don't, it's no good. Well, that's what I thought was very favorable.
By 1931, Temple Buell had mastered brick school architecture. Horace Mann is an example of that. And the spectacular patterns on that buff brick are so evocative, I think, of really an exotic locale. You look at that and you're not quite sure, is this a Mayan temple or is it just something completely new that you've never seen dropped here in Denver?
Unlike the Fruitdale School, we see his ornamentation really taken up a few notches. Almost wedding cakey facade in its ornamentation of that stacking brickwork.
As we move out of the 20s into the Depression era, you might think that things would be simplified, but in fact, they actually become even more exuberant as he lands commissions for important governmental buildings. You'll see in the brickwork something that reflects the Art Deco style, but it's completely different, and it's something that I think he invented. He was often asked to work in brick, which is a relatively inexpensive material, but he discovered in the great sunlight of Colorado that if you moved the bricks around, if you had them going in and out, you'd get these incredible shade patterns that created just literally movement on the facade of the building, and he mastered that technique. Possibly my favorite Temple Buell building is the Catherine Mullen Memorial Nurses Home, built adjacent to St. Joseph's Hospital. John Mullen, who made his fortune in the wheat business and in ranching, built this in honor of his wife. They wanted people studying nursing to have a place to live that was not only beautiful, but also really state-of-the-art.
The Mullen Building is perhaps the most fantastic example of Buell's elaborate brickwork. We have these plumes of blonde and dark brick that really kind of explode in these elaborate parapets along the top of the building, the texture that he gets. And the brickwork also emphasizes the verticality of the building, so we have your eye kind of going upwards with the line of the bricks.
He is working overtime to create a real explosion of visual interest on the building.
Buell's buildings, perhaps more than most, have to be seen in the context of their times. His work was an architectural reflection of design styles from the 20s through the 50s and significantly shaped the face of Denver.
1938. Towards the end of the Depression, as the war efforts are gearing up, Temple Buell lands a number of government commissions. One of them is for the creation of the Lincoln Park homes, housing that was designed and built as part of a public housing complex. When you look at historic photographs, you'll see this really elegant simplicity to the design. It was not just utilitarian housing. He took simple materials, brick, and he laid them in a way that it created a real sense of architecture, a sense of uniqueness, a place that people who live there could really be proud of.
But in 1988, the Lincoln Park homes were slated for demolition. Although it wasn't within the 50-year criterion for preservation, it was too young essentially to be considered. The State Historic Preservation Officer advocated for its preservation for three main reasons. One, because it was the first public housing project in Denver. Number two, because it was designed by a local prominent architect, our friend Temple Buell. And third, because of the style of the homes, because they were executed in the Art Moderne style. Unfortunately, despite the efforts to preserve the Lincoln Park homes, they were ultimately demolished in 1994.
I read a quote from a resident there, how she was sad to be leaving because she felt like there was such a strong sense of community there. And I think that community was really in part created by his architecture. So World War II comes along and construction really comes to a halt. But he's able to keep his practice going by doing really utilitarian governmental buildings, bomb depots, medical depots, very simple buildings, but you have to remember the time and what was going on. We're in the middle of World War II. There's no money, time, or really desire to have richly decorated buildings.
But the trouble is that, unfortunately, when you get the very functional buildings, you had to spread the money so thin that you couldn't really make very beautiful things.
After World War II, he emerges from the Art Deco period and from that very highly decorative style to become a master of the modernist movement. He embraces the international style of architecture, what was going on in the Bauhaus, and his buildings become very elegantly simple.
As well as his architectural savvy, Buell possessed a keen business sense and cultivated well-placed friends. He also happened to be the life of the party, so he was invited often. Sandy Buell, by all accounts, was fun.
Temple Buell was a mover and shaker in Denver, so it's no surprise he was friends with many politically powerful people. I think part of it was his business acumen, but I think part of it was he was just such a personality. They wanted to know him too.
As far as the architecture world was concerned, he was an introvert. I mean, he could concentrate on what he was doing. He could focus. And then to everybody else, he was an extrovert. He never knew a stranger. He would meet people. Of course, people would know who the tall guy was in the room, because once you met him, you didn't forget him. He was friends of presidents. He also worked well with the guy laying the bricks or the guy digging the ditch. Everybody knew him and respected him.
Clearly, Temple Buell was a great businessman. He comes to Colorado, starts a one-man architectural firm, and it quickly grows to 150 people, the largest architectural firm in the city. The other thing is he paid attention to how Denver was growing, and he saw that it was growing in the direction of what we today call Cherry Creek. In the 1925s, he buys land out there. He knows that's where the city is headed, and he essentially sits on this land for about 30 years until the time is ripe to build Cherry Creek Mall.
The suburbs really didn't start coming until after the war, when all the vets came back. So he was going to do a suburban development.
Buell purchased 49 acres of land from the city, even though it was a city dump.
What Temple did was he came up with this idea of pulling all the businesses together, surrounding them with a parking lot, and then having a central corridor that people could walk up and down and shop.
He'd been working on this design for many years, well before it was built. He also was working off of precedents.
I think that architecture is bigger than the individual building. Architecture is tied into the whole city planning, the movement of people, how people live.
He was really concerned with parking. And he has said how it became burdensome to drive your car downtown to the city center because the arteries weren't big enough. So he's thinking of how to make living in the city easier.
So people could park in one place, visit all these stores, and then come back to their car. They didn't have to cross a major street to get to the shopping area.
It's just like the Cathedral of Sarajevo. You take off your shoes to enter. You get out of the car and you're a pedestrian. And you have to take care of your beast of burden. You have to park that before you can go. But then when you go inside the cathedral, you want to be able to go any place, and there should be no traffic across that mall. That mall should be sacred.
Although Cherry Creek was not America's first pedestrian mall, it was the first truly successful one. Buell credited its popularity to handiness. With his design, shopping just got easier.
As the father of the shopping mall, in many ways, he really is also the father of city development here in America for the last 40 to 50 years.
He paid $25,000 for the trash dump on Cherry Creek. In 1974, it was valued at $50 million.
Now, what's your key to success?
Work.
Okay. What kind of working day would you put in?
Oh, God. Sometime 14, 15, 16 hours.
Marjorie finally got tired of the always out of the office. If he ever wanted to do anything social, it had to be so he could generate clients, where he wanted to do things that were just plain social and fun. And so she finally just got tired of it. His second marriage was to Virginia Bennett, married in 1963, and they were divorced in 1969. Third marriage was Sherry Montague Buell, a younger woman, and Sherry is going to reform him. He's drinking too much, and he's not eating the right foods, and eventually things went bad in that marriage as well. Single the rest of his life, being single or even being married was not a deterrent to Temple Buell. There are various stories about the number of female friends he had.
Despite a notorious reputation as a ladies' man, Temple Hoyne Buell also had quite a philanthropic renown.
The architecture and the development had all been very positive for him, so how could he give back? And I think that was the beginning of the thoughts of a foundation to support charitable giving. And of course, Mr. Buell made all the decisions. It was his money. He designated $6 million back to the University of Illinois for the Temple Hoyne Buell Hall of Architecture. That was his alma mater, and he wanted to give back. He also did a significant grant to Columbia to renovate a building back there, the Octagon. That was also where he'd gone to school. So he wanted to give back to things that had contributed to his success. As of June 2019, we're at about $476 million at the Temple Hoyne Buell Foundation.
The Cherry Creek Mall is actually the primary asset of the Temple Buell Foundation, and it provides the revenue to be able to provide the millions of dollars of grants each year.
Recognizing that to make a difference, we needed to focus, and we wanted to pick an area where our dollars would make a difference. And the area that was coming up was early childhood development.
Here at History Colorado, we have the Temple Buell Architectural Archives. While those archives do contain some of Temple Buell's work, they were created to really collect the works of all of the significant architecture from the 1950s into contemporary time here in Colorado.
So Temple Buell was 94 when he died in 1990.
He left a really rich legacy. Spanning from urban design and contemporary urban issues all the way to education here in Colorado.
In terms of the arts, the Temple Hoyne Buell Theater, the building itself, has increased both the breadth and popularity of live theater in Denver. Of course, the most obvious legacies of Temple Hoyne Buell are his buildings that endure.
In 1983, the Paramount Theater was saved from demolition by the Friends of the Paramount. They essentially bought the building in order to preserve it.
The organs have been restored, the tapestries have been restored, the terracotta, all of those materials have really been brought back. So today you get a true sense of what it looked like when it was built in the 1930s.
The 1927 Fruitdale School in Wheat Ridge is the oldest standing Buell building. But vandals and time failed to respect that. Nonetheless, this historic treasure is filled with new purpose.
The school was transformed into 16 apartments, 5 of which are considered affordable housing units. And in terms of preservation, adaptive reuse is a really excellent way to keep a building alive. The Mullen Building was dedicated in 1933.
Today the building serves as offices for St. Joseph's Hospital. It has undergone some restoration work.
The State Historical Fund supported the restoration of a total of 154 historic windows of the building.
I think the building is now set to serve the hospital well into the 21st century. A number of buildings he worked on have been demolished, and that's sad, but I think the buildings that remain are so clearly artistic masterpieces that I want to believe people will always value them and that we will keep them around for many, many years to come.
So because of the breadth of the projects that he carried out, he really touched all facets of life. He wasn't just designing for the wealthy. He wasn't just designing schools. He was really impacting the state, where you shop, where you go when you're sick. So it's hard to live in the state without experiencing Temple Buell in one shape or another. And you may not even be aware of it, but you have.